The year was 1865, and the frontier was a land of both opportunity and death, where men carved their names into the dirt, and women had to decide if they would be dirt or diamonds. The town of Glenwood was a patch of rough stone and sun-scorched timber, where life was measured in cattle, whiskey, and broken promises. Tonight, the air was thick with smoke and the hum of anticipation, for the town was alive with the excitement of the annual festival. Every year, the good folk came together to forget the hard months behind and to hope for better ones ahead. But tonight, for Emma Carlisle, it would be a night that twisted fate in ways she had never imagined. Emma stood on the edge of the crowded square, her dress billowing slightly in the warm evening breeze, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses weaving through the air. Her eyes, dark with the weight of her father's failing ranch and the cruel hand of time, flickered over the faces in the crowd. Her mother had been long dead, and now the only thing Emma had left was the land she tended and the broken legacy of her family. And, perhaps, a secret she'd never share with anyone. Her heart, wild and untamed, yearned for more than the dusty plains and the blood-soaked struggle of survival. That was when she saw him, Silas Creed. He was impossible to miss. The cattle baron stood across the square, surrounded by a small entourage of well-dressed men, all sharp suits and steely eyes. Creed's reputation was a dark cloud that hung over every town he touched. Some said he owned more cattle than the state of Texas itself. Others claimed he'd made his fortune through bloodshed and ruthless dealings. No one dared cross him. Emma had always heard of him, but seeing him in the flesh, his cold eyes cutting through the noise like a wolf among sheep, made her shiver. Her pulse quickened, a strange thrill igniting in her chest, a feeling she could not name. She turned her gaze away quickly, but not before Creed's eyes locked onto hers. His stare was like a brand, searing through her, as if he saw right through her to the parts of herself she kept buried deep. A flicker of something, a smile, perhaps, crossed his lips, and for a moment Emma felt as if she were caught in the glare of a predator. But she would not be prey. Not tonight. She moved through the crowd, her steps quick and purposeful, though her mind raced with thoughts she had no business entertaining. Creed's eyes followed her, and she felt the weight of them like the sun on her skin, burning, relentless. But it wasn't just his gaze that unsettled her. It was the way the crowd parted around him, how the men's shoulders tensed in his presence, and the way the women whispered behind their fans. Silas Creed was not just a man. He was an institution, and tonight, Emma felt the grip of his power tightening around her throat. As the evening stretched on, Emma found herself retreating to the far edge of the square, near the stables where the horses stamped restlessly, eager to break free of their confines. She had always found solace in the company of animals. They were honest, simple creatures. Unlike men, they did not hide their intentions behind false smiles. But just as she leaned against the wooden post, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and leather, the sound of footsteps made her turn. And there he was, as if summoned by some unseen force. "You're a long way from the dance floor, Miss Carlisle." Silas Creed's voice was low, smooth, and cold, like the edge of a blade. Emma stiffened, her hands instinctively clutching the reins of the horse beside her. "I was just admiring the night air, Mr. Creed," she said, her tone steady despite the rush of heat that flooded her chest. Creed took a step closer, his presence looming like a storm cloud, dark and overwhelming. "Is that so? I'd say you were trying to escape the noise. You're not one for crowds, are you?" Her heart hammered, but she held her ground, meeting his gaze. "I prefer solitude, and I've never been fond of men who think their wealth gives them the right to judge others." Creed chuckled, a sound that sent a ripple of unease down her spine. "You're a sharp one, Emma Carlisle. I like that. Most women I meet are too busy smiling to see the world for what it really is." She didn't respond immediately, but the challenge hung in the air between them, thick as smoke. For a moment, they stood there in the silence, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind through the leaves. And then, as if on some unspoken cue, he moved closer, so close that she could feel the heat of his body against her skin. His scent was that of leather, tobacco, and something more dangerous, like the edge of a storm. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Carlisle," he said, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "I've been watching you. You've got fire in you. I like that. Makes things interesting." Her breath caught in her throat, but she refused to let him see the effect he was having on her. "You're a man who gets what he wants. Isn't that right, Mr. Creed?" "Indeed I am. And right now what I want is you." Before she could respond, his lips crashed against hers. The kiss was sudden, forceful, and as shocking as it was, Emma couldn't pull away. His hands gripped her shoulders, pulling her into him with a hunger she hadn't expected, his lips insistent and possessive. It was not the kind of kiss she had imagined in her secret daydreams. There was no tenderness, no sweetness, just the overwhelming power of a man who took what he desired without hesitation. The world spun around her, and for a moment, Emma was lost in the intensity of it. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she felt his touch claim her in a way that felt wrong, but at the same time, as though it was the only thing that had ever made sense. But then, just as suddenly as it began, the kiss ended. Creed pulled back, his eyes dark with some private satisfaction. "Now, Miss Carlisle," he said, his voice low and measured, "you're in my debt, and debts, you'll find, are things that must always be paid." Emma staggered back, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to collect herself. Her lips still tingled with the heat of his kiss, but beneath it there was something far colder, a terrible truth she could no longer deny. "I don't owe you anything," she spat, her voice trembling with the anger and humiliation that surged through her. "You're nothing but a bully." Creed smiled then, a cold, calculating smile. "Oh, I think you do, Emma. Your father's debts are well known. The land you hold, the cattle he's gambled away, it's all mine now, in a way you can't even imagine." Her heart sank like a stone. She had known the rumors, had heard whispers in town about her father's gambling losses, but she had hoped against hope, that it was all exaggeration. Now, standing before her, Silas Creed made it all too real. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You can't just take everything from me." "I already have," Creed replied, his eyes dark with a cold finality. "And unless you want to see your family's name dragged through the dirt, you'll agree to my terms." Emma felt the weight of his words like an anchor pulling her under. Her chest tightened, and her mind raced for some way out, but there was nothing, no escape. She was trapped. "I'll marry you," she said, the words like ash on her tongue. "But I'll never be yours." "Not really." Creed's smile widened, sharp as a knife. "We'll see about that. A woman like you, with fire in her veins? You'll belong to me more than you realize." As he turned and walked away, Emma stood there, her hands trembling at her sides, the taste of his kiss still lingering on her lips. The kiss that had bound her to him, body and soul, forever. Emma woke to the sound of horses whinnying and the faint creak of the ranch's front gate opening. But it was the smell of the place that hit her first. Earth, leather, and the thick scent of cattle dung that clung to the air like a foul, ever-present fog. The Castle Creek Ranch, as Silas called it, sprawled across miles of barren, dusty land. The house itself was an imposing structure of stone and wood, designed more to intimidate than to welcome. There were no gardens, no traces of color, just the dry, cracked earth that seemed to bleed under the sun. She lay in the large, empty bed, the sheets smooth and foreign against her skin, and let her gaze drift to the heavy curtains drawn tight against the morning light. The bed had been made for a king, and yet it felt like a prison. Her wrists ached from the tightness of the silver rings Creed had placed on them, his marking, as he called it. Not even the soft cotton sheets could ease the tension gnawing at her bones. Her first thought was of escape, but the sound of footsteps outside the door shattered that fantasy. She quickly sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders like a shield. The door creaked open, and there stood the woman who had been assigned to watch her, the housekeeper, though Emma had never caught her name. "Breakfast, Miss Carlisle," the woman said in a voice as soft as dust. Her face was weathered from years of hard living, but her eyes held a wary sympathy. "Thank you," Emma muttered, forcing herself to stand. She had not yet found the courage to make her presence known to the rest of the ranch's inhabitants, nor had she dared to look Silas in the eye since the night he forced her into this gilded cage. The woman hesitated before placing the tray on the bed. "Mr. Creed expects you to be in the dining room within the hour," she added, her gaze darting nervously toward the door. Emma nodded. There was little point in resisting. Silas Creed had made it clear that he owned her now, and he expected his possessions to behave accordingly. The meal was simple: a few eggs, some dried beef, and a glass of water, so cold it nearly froze her fingers. It was nothing like the feast she had grown up with at her family's ranch, where the table was always overflowing with good food and company. Here, there was only silence, broken by the occasional sound of a rider's boots on the stone floors. The ranch hands were ghosts to her, their faces blank when they passed by. They had no eyes for Emma, just like the rest of the world. She was a commodity now, a pawn in a game she hadn't chosen to play. When she arrived in the dining room, Silas was already seated at the long, oak table, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His dark eyes tracked her every movement, studying her as though she were a piece of livestock being sold at auction. He didn't speak as she sat down, only took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving her. Emma stiffened, unable to hold back the bitterness that welled inside her. "I assume I've been brought here to play the part of your obedient wife," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her anger, though buried beneath layers of fear and uncertainty, was still sharp. Silas smirked, the corners of his mouth curling upward like a predator toying with its prey. "Oh, Emma, my dear, you're not just my wife. You're my investment. You'll learn that soon enough." The words cut through her like a knife. He was right, of course. This wasn't love, and it never would be. This was business, a transaction. The days passed with a monotony that numbed her spirit. Silas kept her close, but always at a distance. He would come to her room at night, his touch cold and possessive, and then leave her to lie awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling. There was no tenderness, no affection, only the cold weight of his ownership. During the day, she was locked within the house, never allowed to wander outside unless he gave permission. She watched from the windows as the ranch hands worked the land, heard the rumble of cattle being driven across the plain, but never once did she see the world beyond the walls of Castle Creek. The only thing that provided a shred of comfort were the moments when Luke Rawlins came to check on her. He was the foreman of the ranch, a man who spoke little but seemed to understand far more than he let on. There was something about him, something that made Emma uneasy, though she couldn't place it. He was not like the other men. His eyes, dark and scarred from the brutality of the world, held a sadness that resonated with her own. But it was not just his past that intrigued her. It was the way he looked at her, careful, calculating, yet always with a measure of respect. He never treated her like an object, not like Silas did. One morning, when the sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the ranch, Luke appeared at the door of Emma's room. "Miss Carlisle," he said in his low, gravelly voice, "Mr. Creed wants you in the barn." Emma's eyes narrowed. "I've no interest in seeing him," she spat, though the words tasted sour on her tongue. Luke hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the door. "I'm not here to argue with you, ma'am. Just do what he asks. It won't take long." Her defiance flared briefly, but she saw the hard set of his jaw and the way his shoulders tensed, as though bracing for something. She knew he was no fool. He was loyal to Silas, but he wasn't a puppet. She could feel it in the air between them. "Fine," she said, her voice tight with anger and something else, something she had yet to name. The barn was a sprawling structure, filled with the scent of sweat and hay. As they walked through the door, Emma's eyes darted around, but there was no sign of Silas. Instead, she found herself standing face to face with Luke, his eyes studying her with a quiet intensity that unsettled her more than it reassured. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to stay with him." Luke's gaze hardened, and for a brief moment, Emma saw the anger flash behind his calm exterior. "I don't have a choice, Miss Carlisle. I owe Creed a debt. You don't know the things he's done to keep me here." Emma's heart raced. "Then leave. You don't have to be part of this." Luke's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not that simple," he murmured, and with a glance toward the door, he added, "I'll help you when I can. But don't make the mistake of thinking you're alone. Silas doesn't just control you. He controls everything around here. Even me." It was then that Emma understood. Luke was as trapped as she was. The thought stung like cold iron against her skin. For the next few days, her routine became even more suffocating. Silas's demands grew more frequent and more insistent, but his control remained just as cold. The ranch became her prison, the walls closing in around her until there was nothing left but the inevitability of her fate. But Emma was not a woman to surrender quietly. She had been brought here against her will, but she would not bend to Silas's tyranny. Not yet. As each day passed, she learned more about the world she was trapped in and about the man who held the keys to her future. The seventh day arrived with a storm on the horizon, the winds howling through the canyon like wolves seeking their prey. Emma stood at the window, watching the sky darken, feeling the weight of her choices pressing down on her chest. She had made up her mind. She would escape. The storm that had been gathering all week finally broke. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the scent of rain and dust. Emma stood by the window, watching the dark clouds gather like a threat over Castle Creek. There was no peace in the air, only the promise of something far worse than the storm that brewed inside her heart. She had spent the last 7 days stewing in a cauldron of fear, anger, and desperation. The ranch had become a suffocating cage, its walls closing in around her. Silas had tightened his grip, his demands growing bolder with each passing day. But today she knew it was time. She could no longer bear the thought of another night in his house, another hour under his control. It was now or never. The moment she turned from the window, a knock came at the door. She didn't need to ask who it was. The sound of heavy boots on the stone floors could only belong to one man. Luke Rawlins. "Miss Carlisle," he said, his voice low, rough as gravel. He didn't look at her, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched at his sides. "What is it?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. She knew what he was here for, even before he spoke. "They're coming. Mr. Creed. He knows you're trying to leave." Luke stepped closer, his gaze flicking nervously toward the door. "I'll help you, but you need to move now." Emma's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel the sweat trickling down her back, but there was no turning back. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the moment where everything she'd suffered under Silas Creed would either break her or set her free. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Where do we go?" she asked. "The stables," Luke said, his voice tight with urgency. "I've already saddled the horses. If we leave now, we can make it to the river by morning." She nodded without a word, her mind already racing through the possibilities. They would have to move fast. Silas wouldn't take this betrayal lightly. He'd already shown her how cruel he could be, how far he would go to get what he wanted. But Emma had made up her mind. She wasn't going to be a pawn in his game anymore. As she grabbed the coat from the back of the door, she saw Luke watching her, his eyes full of a mixture of wariness and something softer, something that she couldn't quite place. "You don't have to do this, you know," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You could leave with me." Luke's lips pressed together, his jaw clenched with a quiet strength. "I don't have a choice," he said, his voice dark with regret. "You're not the only one trapped here, Miss Carlisle." He turned without another word and led her down the narrow hallway. Emma's heart raced as they moved through the house like shadows, every creak of the floorboards echoing in her ears. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable crash of Silas's fury. When they reached the back door, Luke pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning under the strain. The night air was thick with the smell of rain and earth, the sky a swirling mass of black clouds above them. The barn loomed in the distance, its silhouette like a dark sentinel standing guard over the land. They moved fast, but silently, ducking into the shadows as they crossed the yard. The horses were already waiting, 2 strong, dark animals, their reins tied to the hitching post. Luke mounted his horse first, then reached down to help Emma up onto hers. She swung her leg over the saddle, feeling the familiar weight of the leather beneath her, the power of the animal beneath her. "Stay close," Luke muttered, his voice low and urgent. "And don't look back." They rode out of the yard a trot, the sound of hooves muffled by the wind. The rain began to fall in thick sheets, cold and heavy, as though the sky itself was trying to wash away the sins of the land. Emma's thoughts raced, a whirlwind of fear, anger, and hope. Her fingers tightened around the reins, but she kept her eyes straight ahead. There would be no turning back now. They rode hard through the darkened countryside, the horses pushing forward with a desperate energy that matched the pounding of Emma's heart. She didn't know how far they'd go, how long they'd be able to outrun Silas's men, but she had no other choice. The river was their only chance, the only way to escape the hell that had been her life since that reckless kiss. As they neared the edge of the ranch, the first shots rang out behind them, sharp and urgent, cutting through the night like a warning. "They're coming," Luke growled, his voice taut with urgency. "We got to move faster." The horses surged forward, their muscles straining under the weight of the chase. Emma gritted her teeth, her body tensing with every stride, her mind focused on one thing only: survival. The gunfire grew louder, closer now, the crack of a rifle echoing through the night air. Emma dared not look back. She knew the men were closing in, knew that Silas's wrath was catching up to them. But she couldn't let that stop her. She couldn't let fear paralyze her now. They reached the river just as the moon emerged from behind the clouds, casting a silver light over the rushing water. The sound of it filled Emma's ears, drowning out everything else. The current was swift and wild, but the horses knew the way, their instincts sharp as they plunged into the water. But they were not alone. A shot rang out from the darkness, a bullet striking the water just inches from Emma's horse. The animal reared, throwing her from the saddle, and she hit the ground hard, the air knocked from her lungs. "Emma!" Luke's voice was frantic as he dismounted, grabbing her by the arm and hauling her to her feet. "We've got to go." She didn't argue. They ran, their boots slipping in the mud as they made their way toward the water's edge. The men were closing in, their voices rising in the dark. Silas's men had caught up, but they weren't fast enough. Not yet. Just as they reached the water, another shot rang out. Luke grunted as the bullet hit him in the shoulder, the force sending him to his knees. Emma's heart stopped as she watched him fall, the blood already staining his shirt. "No!" She rushed to his side, panic clawing at her throat. "Go, Emma," Luke grunted, his face twisted in pain. "You have to go. Now." Tears burned in Emma's eyes, but she knew he was right. She had to run. She had to survive. She pressed her hands against his wound, but there was no time to stop and help him now. The river was their only escape. "Don't make me leave you," she whispered through clenched teeth, but Luke only gave her a grim smile. "Go," he said one last time, his voice filled with the kind of determination that broke Emma's heart. With a final, desperate glance, Emma turned and ran toward the river. The water roared as it swept past her, and she didn't look back. She couldn't. The storm was raging now, the rain falling in torrents, but Emma didn't feel the cold. She didn't feel the fear, the pain. All she felt was the pull of freedom, the taste of it on her lips, and the fire that burned deep in her chest. She would live. She would fight for it, and she would never let Silas Creed take that away from her. The river swallowed her up, and the world seemed to disappear into the night.